Most corrupt Louisiana State Prison inside Angola Prison. There is a prison in America where men have gone in as teenagers and died as old men. A place so vast it has its own zip code. So isolated that escape once meant certain death. So feared that inmates call it the farm, not because it grows food, but because it harvests human lives. This is Louisiana State Penitentiary, known to the world by one name, Angola, built on the bones of a former slave plantation, run for decades like a kingdom with no witnesses, a place where violence was policy, silence was survival, and corruption wasn't hidden, it was institutional. Men were beaten to death. Others disappeared into cells and were never the same. Guards ruled through terror. Inmates ruled through blood, and the outside world looked away. Tonight, we go inside the walls of America's most notorious prison to expose the corruption, the crimes, and the system that allowed Angola to become a modern American hell. This is not just a prison story. This is a story about power, race, control, and what happens when a system is allowed to operate in darkness for over a century. 18,000 acres. That's how big Angola Prison is. To put that into perspective, it's larger than Manhattan, surrounded on 3 sides by the Mississippi River, and on the 4th by endless swamp and farmland. Angola wasn't just built to confine prisoners. It was built to isolate them. The prison sits on land, once known as Angola Plantation, named after the African country where enslaved people were stolen from and brought here in chains. After Civil War, slavery ended, but Angola didn't. The plantation simply changed its name and its business model. Instead of slaves, it used prisoners. Instead of whips, it used guards. Instead of chains, it used sentences so long they might as well have been death. By the early 1900s, Louisiana had created something unique in America, a prison run like a private labor camp, where incarcerated men worked the fields from sunup to sundown, often at gunpoint. And for decades, what happened inside Angola stayed inside Angola. No cameras, no oversight, no accountability, just power. By the 1950s, Angola had earned a reputation so violent that even hardened criminals feared being sent there. Murders were common. Rape was routine. Guards were rumored to bet on inmate fights. And survival often meant joining a gang or becoming someone's property. This wasn't rehabilitation. This was organized chaos. And at the center of it all was a culture of corruption so deep it became normalized. A prison built on slavery. To understand Angola, you have to understand what it replaced. Before it was a prison, Angola was a plantation. Thousands of enslaved Africans were forced to work this land, beaten, starved, and killed for profit. When slavery was abolished in 1865, Louisiana faced a problem. Its economy depended on free labor. So the state found a loophole: convict leasing. Minor crimes, loitering, vagrancy, stealing food, became reasons to arrest black men en masse. Those men were then leased to private plantations, including Angola. The system was legal, and it was brutal. Prisoners were worked to death. Illness went untreated. Escape attempts were punished with executions. By the time Angola officially became a state penitentiary, in 1901, the foundation had already been laid. This was a place where human life was expendable. As the decades passed, Angola expanded, not just in size, but in reputation. By the 1930s and 40s, it was infamous for armed guards patrolling on horseback, forced farm labor, racial segregation, corporal punishment, near total lack of oversight. Former inmates later described it as slavery by another name. And in many ways, they weren't wrong. Welcome to hell. By the mid-20th century, Angola had become a pressure cooker. Cells were overcrowded. Medical care was almost non-existent, and violence was constant. New inmates were often assaulted within days. Rape wasn't just ignored. It was expected. Guards rarely intervened. Why? Because chaos made control easier. If inmates feared each other more than the staff stayed in power. Former prisoners later testified that guards would intentionally place vulnerable inmates with known predators. Protection wasn't free. It was traded for loyalty, for silence, or for labor. Angola wasn't just corrupt. It was strategically cruel. The farm line. Every morning, armed guards lined up prisoners and marched them into the fields. Cotton, corn, soybeans. Men worked under the Louisiana sun for hours, sometimes with rifles aimed at their backs. This wasn't rehabilitation. This was profit. Angola produced millions of dollars in agricultural goods each year, and the labor was nearly free. For many inmates, the fields were more dangerous than the cell blocks. Heat stroke, injuries, beatings. If you collapsed, you were replaced and buried quietly. Angola wasn't an accident. It wasn't a failure. It was designed this way. A prison born from slavery, maintained through fear, and protected by silence. But the real horror of Angola wasn't just the past. It was what happened when the world finally started paying attention and realized how deep the corruption truly went. Because in the years ahead, Angola would become known for something else. A level of violence so extreme, it would shock the nation. And a scandal so explosive, it would expose the prison's darkest secret. The blood years, murder, rape, and absolute control. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Angola entered what many survivors would later call the blood years. This was the era when violence inside the prison reached a level so extreme that even other maximum security prisons whispered Angola's name with fear. There were no cameras in the cell blocks, no independent oversight, no meaningful investigations. What happened inside Angola was handled internally by the same people responsible for keeping order, and order was already gone. A prison run by. At Angola, guards didn't truly control the prison. The inmates did, but not equally. Power belonged to gangs, predators, and long-term prisoners who had learned how to navigate violence like a second language. New arrivals, especially young, nonviolent offenders, were immediately assessed, not by officials, by other inmates. Who you were placed with could decide your fate. Some inmates were claimed within hours. Others were beaten until they submitted. Many never spoke about what happened, because speaking meant retaliation. Former prisoners later testified that guards often knew exactly what was happening and did nothing. Why? Because violence served a purpose. A divided prison was easier to manage than a united one. No one is coming. In most prisons, violence triggers lockdowns, investigations, consequences. At Angola, it barely slowed the day down. Murders were often classified as inmate-on-inmate incidents. Rape reports were dismissed or never filed. Injured prisoners were accused of fighting or lying. Medical care was delayed or denied altogether. If you were stabbed, you waited. If you survived, you stayed quiet. If you didn't, your death became a statistic. Former inmates would later describe a chilling realization they all shared. No one was coming to help. Not the courts, not the state, not the public. Angola existed beyond accountability. The Angola Three began to emerge. But in the middle of this chaos, something unexpected happened. Resistance. In the early 1970s, political consciousness began to spread inside Angola, largely influenced by the civil rights movement and the rise of black political activism outside the walls. Some inmates started organizing, reading, educating, challenging abuse. Among them were three men whose names would one day echo far beyond Angola's fences: Albert Woodfix, Herman Wallace, Robert King. They became known as the Angola Three. They spoke out against sexual violence. They protested inhumane conditions. They aligned themselves with the Black Panther movement, and ACT prison officials saw not as ideology, but as a direct threat, because organized prisoners were dangerous, not violent. Organized, retaliation, and solitary confinement. In 1972, a white prison guard was found murdered. Almost immediately, attention turned to the activists. Albert Woodfix and Herman Wallace were accused. The evidence was thin. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Key testimony later collapsed under scrutiny, but the verdict didn't matter. The message did. Both men were convicted and sent to solitary confinement, not for months, not for years, for decades, 23 hours a day, in cells the size of a bathroom, minimal human contact, no meaningful review. Robert King would later join them. Together, they would spend a combined over 100 years in solitary confinement, the longest known stretch in American history. Their punishment wasn't just incarceration. It was isolation, a warning to every other inmate. Challenge the system, and you disappear. Angola had perfected its control. Violence ruled the cell blocks. Fear ruled the inmates. And isolation crushed anyone who spoke too loudly. But outside the walls, something was beginning to change. Lawsuits were forming. Journalists were asking questions. And the federal government was about to take a hard look at Angola. What they found would expose decades of corruption and force the prison into the national spotlight. But reform would come at a cost, because power never gives itself up quietly. The federal reckoning, lawsuits, exposure, and a system on trial. For nearly a century, Angola operated in the shadows. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, something unprecedented happened. The outside world started listening. The courts step in. It didn't begin with a single lawsuit. It began with a flood. Former inmates, civil rights attorneys, human rights advocates. One by one, cases were filed against the Louisiana Department of Corrections, alleging brutality, neglect, unconstitutional conditions, and systematic abuse at Angola. The claims were staggering. Inmates housed in cells without sanitation, severe overcrowding, routine violence ignored by staff, medical care so poor it bordered on deliberate indifference. But the most damning allegation of all was this. Angola had allowed violence to become policy. Federal judges took notice. And for the first time in its history, Angola was forced to open its doors, not to new prisoners, but to scrutiny, a cruel and unusual place. Court-ordered inspections revealed what inmates had been saying for decades. The prison was dangerously understaffed. Guards were poorly trained. Oversight was almost non-existent. In some dormitories, a single officer was responsible for supervising over 100 inmates. At night, entire sections of the prison were effectively abandoned. Judges described the conditions using words rarely found in official rulings. Inhumane, degrading, unconstitutional. One federal court famously declared that Angola violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. It was a legal earthquake, and it forced Louisiana to make a choice: reform or federal takeover. Enter Burro Kane. In 1995, Angola got a new warden. His name was Burro Kane. Kane presented himself as a savior, a man of faith, a reformer, a disciplinarian who could restore order to the most violent prison in America. Under Kane, Angola changed, at least on the surface. He expanded inmate programs, encouraged religion, allowed media access that had once been unthinkable. Violence statistics dropped, and the national narrative shifted. Angola was no longer just America's bloodiest prison. It was being rebranded as a model of reform. But critics warned there was another side to Burro Kane's Angola, one that didn't make the brochures: reform or rebranding. While conditions improved in some areas, power remained centralized. Kane ruled Angola like a kingdom. Decisions were personal. Punishments were discretionary. Favor was rewarded, and dissent was still crushed. Solitary confinement continued. The Angola Three remained isolated. Critics were silenced. Some inmates benefited from the changes. Others disappeared into the same old system, just with better public relations. Angola had learned something critical. Visibility could be managed. The federal reckoning didn't dismantle Angola. It reshaped it. The change became invisible. The violence became quieter. The corruption became harder to prove. But beneath the surface, the same questions remained. Had Angola truly changed, or had it simply evolved? Because soon, new allegations would surface, this time involving money, power, and the man who claimed to have saved the prison. and what they revealed would once again drag Angola into scandal. The King of Angola, power, profit, and the Burl Cane scandal. For nearly 2 decades, one man defined Angola Prison. To supporters, he was a reformer who tamed America's most violent penitentiary. To critics, he was something else entirely, a ruler, and Angola was his kingdom. The warden as a brand. Under Warden Burl Cane, Angola became a spectacle. Media crews were invited in. Journalists were shown smiling inmates, clean dorms, and thriving programs. The prison rode horses instead of riot shields. Cane spoke often about faith. He promoted religion as a solution to violence, allowing inmate-led churches, ministries, and religious events. And, to be fair, some lives genuinely changed, but the power structure remained unchanged. Cane had near total authority over staff promotions, inmate privileges, program access, disciplinary decisions. Angola didn't answer to committees. It answered to Cane. And when power concentrates that completely, accountability evaporates. Follow the money. In the early 2010s, auditors started asking questions, not about violence, about money. Angola ran massive operations, a prison rodeo, farmland, craft sales, media events. Millions of dollars flowed through Angola every year, but records didn't always add up. Investigators discovered that Burl Cane had approved contracts benefiting people close to him, including his own family. His sons reportedly received lucrative prison-related deals. State property was allegedly used for personal projects. Public funds blurred into private benefit. What Angola had perfected with violence, it now repeated with finances. Control without oversight. The fall. In 2015, after years of scrutiny, Burl Cane resigned. No dramatic trial. No public confession. Just a quiet exit. The man who once stood as a symbol of Angola's rebirth, left under a cloud of ethical violations and financial misconduct allegations. For supporters, it felt like betrayal. For critics, it was confirmation. Angola hadn't been reformed. It had been rebranded. The cost of silence. Even as leadership changed, the long-term consequences remained. The Angola Three had lost decades of their lives. Solitary confinement, once routine, was only slowly being questioned. Life sentences still dominated the population, and Angola remained what it had always been, a prison designed for permanence, a place where release was the exception, not the expectation. The scandal didn't end Angola, but it exposed something deeper. Corruption in Angola wasn't just about money or power. It was about time. Time stolen. Time erased. Time no one could ever get back. With Cane gone, Angola stood at a crossroads. The world believed the worst was over. But behind the walls, another reality persisted, one defined not by scandals, but by sentences so long they turned prisons into graveyards. Because Angola was about to face its most haunting truth, a population condemned to die inside its walls. Life means life. Angola's death row in the prison of no return. At Angola, a sentence is not measured in years. It is measured in endings. Because for most men who arrive here, there is no going home. A prison designed for permanence. More than 70% of Angola's population is serving life sentences. No parole. No early release. No second chances. This single statistic defines Angola more than any scandal, any riot, any warden. Angola is not a place of correction. It is a place of containment. Most inmates here will die inside the walls, not because they are sentenced to death, but because the system has decided their lives are already over. Former wardens called it efficient. Inmates call it slow execution, the end of the line. Louisiana has historically been one of the harshest sentencing states in America. Mandatory minimums, habitual offender laws, limited parole eligibility. For decades, Angola became the final destination for men swept up by these policies. Some were violent offenders. Others were not. Many were young, poor, uneducated, disproportionately black. Once sentenced, their futures collapsed into a single word: life. At Angola, life means exactly what it sounds like. You age here. You get sick here. You die here. And the institution is built to outlast you. Death row at Angola. For those sentenced to death, Angola becomes something else entirely. Death row, a separate world within the prison, defined by isolation, routine, and waiting. Cells are smaller. Movement is limited. Time stretches unnaturally. Inmates spend decades awaiting appeals, some eventually seeing their sentences overturned, others watching execution dates approach and vanish again. Death row is not constant terror. It is constant uncertainty. And that uncertainty reshapes the mind, the psychology of forever. What does it do to a person to know there is no finish line? Psychologists who studied Angola inmates found high levels of depression, emotional withdrawal, and resignation. Hope becomes dangerous. Expectations are stripped away. Many inmates stop counting days. They count meals, seasons, funerals. Some find meaning through work, art, or faith. Others simply endure. Because in a place like Angola, endurance is resistance, buried inside the walls. Angola has its own cemetery, rows of simple markers, numbers instead of names, graves dug by inmates. For inmates, this is where many men sentenced here ultimately end up. No crowds, no headlines, no second look, just another life concluded quietly behind the fence. Angola doesn't need executions to kill people. Time does it for them. Angola is often described as a prison frozen in the past. But its most disturbing feature may be how normal it has become. A system that accepts permanent punishment as routine. A place where life sentences are not debated, only processed. But even here, something unexpected will begin to grow. Voices, stories, men determined to be seen before they disappear. And in the next chapter, we go inside Angola's most unlikely transformation, one that forced America to look directly at the people it had buried alive. What Angola leaves behind. Angola Prison does not end when the gates close behind you. It lingers in the men who entered as boys and never left, in the land that remembers chains before cells, in a system that learned how to survive scandal after scandal, not by changing its foundation, but by learning how to hide its cracks. For more than a century, Angola has been a mirror held up to America's justice system, a mirror that reflects power without oversight, punishment without end, and a belief that some lives are easier to discard than understand. The violence may be quieter now, the corruption more polished, the image more controlled, but the question remains the same. What does justice look like when redemption is removed from the equation? Inside Angola, time replaces hope. Routine replaces possibility, and survival becomes the only form of resistance left. Yet even here, among concrete, wire, and sentences that stretch beyond a lifetime, men have spoken, written, created, and remembered who they were before the system decided who they would be forever. Because the most dangerous thing to any prison built on permanence is a human being who refuses to disappear. This story isn't just about Angola. It's about what we allow to exist in our name, what we tolerate when it happens far from view, and how easily silence becomes policy. If this documentary made you think, if it challenged you, if it pulled back a curtain you'd never seen before, support this work. Like this video so it reaches more people. Share it so these stories don't stay buried behind prison walls. And subscribe to the channel for more deep, investigative crime and prison documentaries that go where others won't. Because stories like this only survive when people are willing to listen. Angola will still be there tomorrow. The fields will still be worked. The cells will still be locked. The only question is, will we keep looking away?